Chapter 11 The Summoning of Two Spirits. Long before sunrise, Kurumi was squatting on the clearing outside. In an earthen bowl, he was roasting and grinding a handful of brown seeds, which looked like outsized lentils. He mixed some whitish ash in with the fine powder. Then, on the triangular grid, he laid a small pile of tobacco leaves, dried them out over the flames, and rubbed them to powder too. In the hut, a few men were draining the last sourish remains of the chicha, but already the women were bringing along fresh supplies of maize and yam to brew some fresh. Nobody thought of forest clearing today. An atmosphere of hangover prevailed. Here and there one might see someone whittling away at a bow and arrow or weaving a large mat. The boys made their own amusements. They tied the necks of 3 puppies together, and the poor creatures almost throttled themselves in trying to get clear of the nooses. After a while, Vito appeared and with bow and arrow. "Let us go, tobacco." And that was an invitation to the magic seance. Obviously, Vito was not only the paramount chief of the TUPARI, but also their head magician. For the first time since my arrival, I saw him naked once more. His arms and legs were painted red with uruku. Round his right wrist he wore a thick circlet carved from the outer shell of a Brazil nut, and round his loins was a thin black string of beads. Kurumi, who seemed to be a sort of sorcerer's apprentice, had meanwhile prepared in the hut next door a small table made up of 3 stakes rammed into the ground, with a wide board over them. On it lay various objects which I had not hitherto seen. Vito told me what they were called. There were 2 long bamboo pipes of the thickness of a finger with black hollow tips. 2 thicker pipes, one of them bearing crudely carved ornamentation, contained the 2 magic powders which Kurumi had ground. In addition, a small broom lay there, skillfully made from the tail hairs of a giant anteater, and 2 corn husk cigarettes. Vito tried to explain to me the purpose of these things. "Eat snuff," he said in execrable Portuguese, and pointed to his nose. Then he rubbed and breathed on the long pipes, almost tenderly. Gradually a good dozen men had assembled. They had brought their stools and settled down in a semicircle round the sorcerer's table. With a mystic gesture, Vito now breathed on the powder holders too, shook from them 2 small heaps on the wooden altar, and swept them tidily into a pile with the little broom. The containers he put on the ground. Then he told me to sit down, and gave brief instructions to a young man who wore a headband made of a jaguar skin. "Yati now, Muru now," said the chief comfortingly, half in Indian, half in Portuguese, as he turned to me. "It won't hurt, and it won't kill you." For in fact, I was to be the first in the impending ritual, snuff-taking. The young man put a pinch of snuff into the tip of one of the 2 pipes, and put it to my nose. I stopped up one nostril and closed my eyes. With a vigorous puff, he blew the charge into my nose. I took a deep breath, just as Vito had told me. Then sight and hearing left me completely. The powder seemed to be burning my nose and throat. I had to cough, spit, and sneeze convulsively. The snuff table, the chief, the hut, all of them were spinning round. When at last I had recovered a little, I noticed to my horror that the young magician was already waiting impatiently with the snuff tube. I looked helplessly at Vito out of my streaming eyes, but my torturers moved him not a whit. Piteously, he called on me to take a second sniff. If I didn't want to make a fool of myself, I must go through with another pinch. This time an almost black haze appeared before my eyes, and I could see my surroundings only as if through a mist. Brown mucus flowed from my nose, and what I spat out in my convulsive coughing had the same diabolical hue. My eyes stung from the biting powder, and my stomach rumbled as if I should vomit. Vito now called a halt. I was allowed to sit down with the others. They all laughed in kindly fashion at me, but when I took out my handkerchief to wipe my nose, they looked annoyed. I was to blow my nose on my fingers and wipe the mucus on the stool. Old Volate, my neighbor, demonstrated to me. All the participants in the ceremony had in the meantime taken their little wooden plugs out of the column of their noses. In front of the little table sat Vito and Quayo, another magician, behind it the pot-bellied Tajuru, and the young sorcerer with the jaguar skin headband had sat down. We others squatted in a semicircle facing the table and the doorway. Now the snuff-taking on the grand scale began. The magician blew some 20 doses into each person's nose. I, too, received another charge, but took good care not to breathe in so vigorously this time. To my delight I saw even the hardened old men contort their faces in pain when they first inhaled. Finally, Vito and Quayo had some 40 doses administered to them. They both puffed and sneezed, groaned, and vomited. The narcotic began to work. The 4 magicians turned on their stools towards the doorway and carried out a series of incantations. With their right hand they pointed out the door, puffed and blew, drew down to themselves invisible objects from the air, and threw them away again. Then they again uttered strange noises. It sounded as if they were choking, and as they did so they tried to seize a mysterious being which to me, at any rate, remained invisible. At last they subsided wearily onto their stools and muttered unintelligible words. A fresh round of snuff-taking began. This time, too, the magicians received far stronger pinches than the other participants. Their reddened eyes stared raptly into the distance. Their faces looked livid with the powder dust. Once more Vito and Quayo turned to face the door. Vito rubbed something white into his hands, smeared some over his head as well, and renewed his attention to his magic activities. At first it looked as if he were pulling something out of the ground. Then he stood up, threw something invisible into the air, went outside the hut, came back inside and set down a small stool in front of where he stood, without once interrupting his incantatory gestures. Once more facing the table, he rested in complete exhaustion for a while and stared absently straight ahead. What could all this mean? I racked my brains in vain. It was afternoon by the time the magicians filled the pipes for the last round. Once again I too had to take a few pinches, and the Indians were vastly amused at seeing how I winced every time the powder shot up into my nose. Next morning Kurumi was again squatting outside the hut, grinding and mixing magic powder. I went off with the men to the forest for clearing operations, but by about 10 o'clock we were already returning home. In Kwarume's Maloka everything was in ready for the magic ceremony. In addition to the small table and all that went with it, there were, this time near the door, 4 pots as well, with various foods, and beside them, piled in a heap, some half-dozen roasted monkeys. I should have very much liked to ask Vito for whom this food was intended, but my knowledge of the language did not yet suffice for this. I did not wish to miss the ceremony either, but what about having to sniff that dreadful magic powder again? I preferred to play the part of a non-participating spectator, and sat down outside the circle of the congregation in a hammock. From there I had a good view of all that went on. The session began as on the previous day, but after the second round of snuff, Vito got up, turned towards the door, stretched out his right hand, and softly sang a little song. It seemed as if he was trying to summon something supernatural to the meal, for now he was squatting before the full pots, and the roast monkeys, pretended to eat, and then took a little out of each pot with his fingers, and held it out towards an invisible being. One of the monkeys as well he offered to the mysterious guest, and finally, from the 4th pot, he scooped out a bowl of chicha and held it aloft for quite a time. But obviously Vito was not sufficiently stupefied to bring the magic ritual to a successful end. Once more he had a few dozen doses blown into his nose, and then continued half unconscious with his mutterings and incantations. With infinite difficulty he seemed to be tugging at a being which, despite all his exertions, would not emerge from the ground. Then, however, he did succeed, and he threw to every member of the congregation something invisible, which they all seemed to make haste to catch. They all whirled their hands round in the air, made the motions of shoveling and rowing, and put their right hands up to their necks. With that, the important part of the session was over. The magicians breathed deeply as if after strenuous work or a breathtaking spectacle. Amid half-murmured chatter and laughter, the assistant magicians, Tajuru and Paduf, blew the remainder of the powder into the nostrils of the congregation. Nor did I escape the 6 doses which Vito had reserved for me. Finally, the chief magician distributed to his colleagues the apes previously offered to the spirits, and his wife brought chicha. Someone brought along his sick child for Vito to pronounce a magic formula over it. I wanted to get a closer look, but the father of the little one told me politely but firmly not to be curious and to go back to my place. With my head full of confused thoughts, I went back into our hut. The boys were waiting for me with a few roast lizards, which they had shot with their little arrows, In addition, they provided a bowl of roasted maize. Vito suddenly appeared and gave me one of the apes which had been among the sacrifices at the ceremony. I thanked him with the customary "Pauvre, it is well." Chapter 12. Ground Nut Harvest and a Feast from a Snake. When darkness fell, the Indians used to lie down in their hammocks, and so at this season they were asleep for the most part by 6:30 or 7. On the other hand, they were awake again several hours before dawn. Many of the men, indeed, got up as early as about 4 o'clock, and since they could not do very much in the darkness, they lit a big fire outside the hut, warmed their naked bodies at it, and chatted. The younger people, on the other hand, went down to the stream to bathe, made a terrific din, shouting, laughing, shrieking, and tootling on long trumpets made from gourds, without worrying in the least about the weary sleepers. Many women got up early too, spun cotton, or worked a string bag by the light of their fire or a small resin torch. If yuccas and yams were to be prepared for brewing chicha, then the chief's wives and their friends were up by 2 in the morning. Naked as they were, they squatted round a huge pile of tubers in the cool draught which came in through the main entrance, peeled them and cut them up amid lively chatter and giggling. Today I was again roused by such cheerful activity. Another carousal was to take place in 2 days. The Indians had already announced that. But first, the chicha must be well and truly earned. At dawn, Vito came to fetch me. "Oka hirab iya," he said. I did not understand. So he tried again in Brazilian. "Mudubi." Mudubi means ground nuts, and since he reinforced his words with unmistakable gestures, I gathered that I was to go and help gather the crop. During this invitation, Vito put on his solemn expression, which admitted of no refusal. With the exception of the few women who were indispensable in the business of brewing, the whole colony went to a nearby field, surrounded by high jungle. The leaves of many ground nut bushes were hanging, withered, a sign that the ground nuts were ripe for gathering. The TUPARI did not let me remain idle for long. "Come here," ordered my old neighbor Valete, with a friendly grin. He squatted down and showed me how to loosen the earth a little with a small stick, and then to pull cautiously at the plant so that the ground nuts were not separated from the roots. Only where the soil was sandy did gathering present no difficulty. The plants with the nuts attached were thrown on 2 large heaps. Round these squatted the women and girls, pulled off the nuts and filled their net bags with them. I tried to keep up with the others, probed in the ground with my stick, groped amid the tangle of stems, leaves, and roots for the stalk of the plant, pulled and tugged, first cautiously, then impatiently, and was astonished when suddenly I was holding only the tap root in my hand and the side roots, while the nuts remained in the ground. The sun beat down hotter and hotter onto the open field, and it soon seemed to Vito that I had worked enough. I was allowed to break off. He brought me a hot teoba tuber, which had been baked in ashes, and which tasted like a good potato. His little daughter, a girl of 10 or 11, came with him. Hitherto she had shyly avoided me, but now, for the first time, she came timidly up to me, tried to smile, and offered me a piece of honeycomb, which was full of little larvae. She told me to dip the comb, larvae and all, in honey, which she held out to me in a gourd. Ika pore, eat that, it tastes good. I had never yet eaten grubs, not even dipped in honey, but who could have resisted? Then the chief led me through his plantation. Of the maize gathered months before, only the withered plants were still standing. In a corner, a few hundred square yards of sugar-cane were growing. Straight across the clearing ran several rows planted with cotton, banana, and tobacco, but the greater part of the field was given over to groundnuts. Aqui capito Vito milho tem muito mudubi tem muito macazera tem muito tabaco tem muito, declared Vito proudly in broken Brazilian. I, Vito, the chief, have much maize, many ground nuts, much yucca, much tobacco. Between huge charred tree trunks he gave me a long account, which seemed to amuse him enormously. On this very spot a few months before, a huge jaguar had attacked a woman and a boy. Hearing their cries, the other Tupari had come running up. He, Vito, was among them. He had tried to shoot the monster, but all his arrows had missed. Then someone had handed him an axe, and with 2 blows he had smashed in the jaguar's head. The beast left behind deep bites and lacerations on the limbs of those he had attacked. He had bitten off one of the old woman's fingers, and in her fright, related Vito, with good-natured sarcasm, she left unmistakable traces on the ground all about her. On the next few days we also went out into the field. The Tupari's groundnuts were bigger than the little things we get in Europe, or which I had seen hitherto in South America. True, they had not such a sweet taste as the smaller varieties, but when boiled they made an excellent and rich meal. I could well understand why the Tupari felt that they could not exist without groundnuts, and even preferred them to Brazil nuts. After a few strenuous days of work, the chief thought that I deserved a change, and invited me to go hunting. The Indians carried bows and arrows. Only Iod, Vito's brother, came unarmed, but he immediately demanded my shotgun. He had learned how to handle firearms when he was with the whites. I did not want to refuse his request, and so I became a mere spectator on the expedition. We bagged a few monkeys, and then back to the groundnut harvest again. The men wove huge mats and baskets to store the crop. Together with the chief's wives, I had to fill up the baskets with nuts and pass them up to the store shelf. A good share was set aside for the neighboring chief, Kwarume. He must evidently have helped in planting out the land, and was now receiving his due share. We had brought in the crop, and were resting outside the hut. The sun was already dipping towards the horizon. Then the chief announced to me, with a solemn expression, that we would now all eat groundnuts together. We sat down on our stools. The women brought out the groundnuts, which they had been cooking during the day, and soon about 40 full pots stood round us. The chief's wives crammed a dollop of groundnut mash into the mouths of Vito and myself with their hands. The chief laughingly let them have their way, and I could hardly fail to follow suit. Then Vito carried a pot to each of the men. They ate a little and then went all round in order to give each other a spoonful of the mash. In this way, I too had a pile of ground nuts on my plate. The Indians put down the empty pots in front of Vito again. Then the hunters began to share their bag. Despite the wood clearing and harvesting, almost all had managed to get hold of something in the forest, which they had saved up for this solemn occasion. Little fishes, grubs, monkeys, armadillos, agoutis, and pacas. Everyone shared out what he had and received titbits in return. Kwarume, the neighboring chief, and old Takururu were slightly merry. Arm in arm they danced round the square and sang a constantly recurring chorus, which Vito interpreted to me as meaning, "The women are to eat many fat grubs until there are none left." Finally the boys came running up. They had a strange request to make. They let each of the men give them a few strokes with a stick. Even little shavers, who could scarcely walk, thrust palm fronds into our hands and wanted to receive a few blows. This seemed to be all part of the ground nut feast. When the merry party finally dispersed, a slight confusion arose. There were 40 cooking pots, and each housewife naturally wanted her own one back. There was animated negotiation, peering and comparing, until at last each one went away contented, carrying her own pot. I began to feel in no wise deserted or lost in the solitude of the jungle. Quite the contrary, I felt how I was settling in more and more with my new friends. What was happening in the world outside no longer interested me. Only quite by chance did I hear one evening a few scraps of the latest news. The BBC reported a huge air traffic to Berlin, by which the Americans intended to snap their fingers at the Russians, and one more conference was planned somewhere to remove some international tension or other. The TUPARI wanted to know what the man in the radio was talking about, but I did not yet feel equal to giving such an explanation. And so I tried my luck with a transmission from Schwarzenberg. The TUPARI listened entranced to a series of Swiss folk songs. They liked, above all, La Haute sur la Montagne, and Vito softly hummed the tune of the last verses, Lioba, Lioba, fraise la pa. That is a song they sing in my tribe, the Suissos, I explained to him. They sing well in your father's tribe, was the chief's opinion. Now you give us a song, demanded his wife, Kamatsuka. But I haven't a good voice, I parried. But you must sing, she persisted, and put on such a pouting expression that I hastened to strike up a little nursery song, the first thing to come into my head, for the old woman couldn't understand what I was singing into her ear. Tomorrow we'll be married. Kurumi fetched me from my hammock at daybreak. We had arranged to go hunting. I hastily ate a few bananas, put on my hob-nailed shoes, stuffed cartridges into my trouser pocket, and reached for my bush knife and shotgun. Our hunting party consisted of the chief Kwarume, his son, and a further half-dozen men and boys, while the little powder which he had scrounged in Salui lasted. Kurumi preferred his old, patched-up shotgun to bow and arrow. All the other Tupari carried their traditional weapons, and in addition the rodent's tooth, on a long handle with which from time to time they sharpened their arrows. Along a narrow track we went into the jungle. We had not gone very far before the Indians discovered a howling monkey. "Howitzt, there's a howling monkey up there. Shoot it down," they urged me. I aimed at the dark object, which stirred far away up in the branches. After 2 shots, the monkey no longer moved. Kurumi gestured eagerly upwards and uttering hissing sounds. Then, with some hastily torn-off twigs, he beat away on my gun. That was to prevent the animal from remaining hanging in the branches or even escaping. Whether it was Kurumi's incantations or the shot in the animal's body, I do not know. But the animal thudded to the ground. It was not yet dead. After its initial stupor, it sat up again and furiously endeavored to defend itself. The Indians laughed. They knew that there was no way of escape and wanted calmly to wait for the end. But I could no longer look on, and gave the bleeding creature the coup de grace with my bush knife. The Indians looked at me in astonishment. One of the young fellows brought a long strip of bast and slung the animal on his back. It was a particularly large male. We went on. Thick forest alternated with less dense patches. We crossed small plains, climbed low hills, and crossed smiling streams. In many places the soil of the forest consisted of deep black humus. On the slopes bare granite blocks burst out of the soil, split and jagged as if struck by a gigantic hammer. In the plains and on the hills the forest was for the most part clear and trim. On damp hillsides and in the valleys where streams flowed, on the other hand, there grew a thick, impenetrable tangle of creepers, shrubs, giant leaves, and bamboo bushes. The Indians whispered about everything which they noticed to left and right of the hunting track. Now and then one of them would stop short, tear a leaf from a bush, fold it, and put it between his lips, in order to imitate with a loud trilling sound the cry of the spider monkey. Suddenly the hunters listened intently. They whispered hastily. A feverish excitement descended on the party. A large tribe of spider monkeys appeared to be in the vicinity. "Don't make so much noise with your shoes," said Kwarume, turning to me, and suddenly Kurumi ran off with a speed I would have never believed the well-fed fellow capable of. The other Indians too vanished into the bushes. Only one boy paused beside me, looking up inquiringly into my face. It was only now that I noticed the great activity in the branches of the surrounding trees. There was a rustling in the twigs, branches were swaying, and curious, short cries were being uttered. The monkeys had realized their danger and were trying to escape. A shot rang out. The Indians ran after the monkeys, which had scattered, and were swinging nimbly from branch to branch. and from tree to tree. A wild pursuit. I listened, tense with excitement. Far off another shot rang out, and from another direction came muffled shouts. Then I was conscious of the reproachful look of my small companion. "Oka Kiora Hadmom," he whispered excitedly, and then he ran on ahead through the bush. I could scarcely keep up with him. Under a huge tree we found the long-legged Amarava. Excitedly he pointed up at the lofty tree. "Ardmira, a she-monkey," he cried with suppressed eagerness. With his bush-knife the boy felled a few small trees, beat against the thick trunk with a cudgel, and both uttered a wild roar. The terrified creature at last burst from her refuge, and tried to escape through the surrounding brushwood, and rejoin her companions. This was just what the Indians had hoped to achieve with the noise they were making, and now they never let the fugitive animal out of their sight. We all three ran, but whenever I thought I could get in a shot, the frightened creature took flight afresh. We panted along in pursuit, paying no heed to thorns or prickles. My feet got caught in creepers, and more than once I measured my length on the ground. My shirt hung about me in tatters, and my hands and face were scratched. At last the monkey stopped and peeped down on us from the fork of a branch. Angrily she shook the branches, which she was clutching. This was so funny to see that it was hard for me to shoot, but the Indians, who had more confidence in my shotgun than in their own arrows, now became annoyed and excitedly urged me to fire. "Koid Tisiru," they incited me. At first I thought this meant "shoot, shoot," but what they were calling out was, "It's a she-monkey with a young one." And that, for a TUPARI, is the best bag of all, for this means 2 animals for 1 shot. My hands were still trembling after my strenuous run. I squeezed the trigger. The animal gave a loud cry and let one arm fall helplessly. I fired again. A convulsive shudder passed through her limbs. Slowly her prehensile feet and tail released their hold of the branches. The monkey fell and struck the floor of the forest with a dull thud. It was a really large she-monkey with a young one, which had also been hit and was clinging only weakly to its dead mother. We went back to our fellow hunters with our bag. Kurumi had shot 2 monkeys in the meantime. One of them had remained hanging in the branches. One of the lads bound his feet round with bast and climbed up in order to knock the animal down with a long pole. Not far away stood a tree bearing ripe palma berries. One of our number climbed to just below the very top, and with his bush knife knocked down a heap of branches. We flung ourselves on the sweet, bright red berries like hungry animals. Then an Indian called me away from the feast and led me further into the bush. In looking for suitable bast for carrying the game, he had almost trodden on a snake, and had quickly killed it with a stick. The reptile, about 2 yards long, with clear markings on its back, lay partly coiled in the undergrowth. It was a rattlesnake of the large species which inhabits these forests. The Indian had smashed its head. I was able to examine the long poisoned fangs without danger, but it was still moving convulsively, and rattled the horny portions of its tail in its final spasms. The day had worn on into the afternoon. The Tupari had fixed up all 4 monkeys with broad loops for carrying. We picked the last palma berries from the branches and set out on our journey home. The youngest of the hunters put the dead apes on their backs. They gave me a large moquita to carry. I had not inquired what was wrapped in the leaves. After a while I began to sweat. Hod potse, the snake is very heavy, said one of my companions, and with a nod of agreement, and grinned. The snake, cold shivers ran down my spine. I suppose it really was dead. Once more we came upon a small colony of monkeys, but the animals fled in all directions when they noticed us. Nor did the Indians show any great enthusiasm this time. Not far from the settlement, we rested in order to singe off the hair from the monkeys and disembowel them. Their bellies were cut open, the guts taken out, the waste matter hastily squeezed out, and even the many long, thin intestinal worms stripped off more or less carefully. The Indians packed up all the offal without washing it in soroka leaves and tied it up with bast. Wrapped up like this, it was the first thing they proposed to stew at home over the fire, and to eat in the company of their wives and children. They did not remove the waste food from the intestines of the young monkeys. It must have been considered tasty and nourishing. The she-monkey which I had shot I now had to carry for the rest of the way. The remainder of the kill was shared out fairly by the hunters, whether they had killed anything or not. The large amount of running about had made me tired, and my knees were almost giving way beneath the weight of the monkey, the snake, and my gun. In the Maloka I had to give an account to all and sundry of how I had fared. I proudly carried the monkey to Vito, and handed over the bundle containing the snake to his son Conquad. And just as I had expected, the chief's wives gave me an abundance of food and drink. They too wanted to know all about the hunt, but for one thing I was very tired, and for another my vocabulary did not run to an exhaustive account. Then Vito came to my aid. Arame ume imako haito. We didn't find any monkeys, but there were hundreds of jaguars running about, was all the satisfaction which he, grinning broadly, would give the curious women. Quite late Conquad called me outside. Over the fire in my aluminum pot was bubbling the snake meat, together with pieces of yam and yucca, seasoned in quite a European fashion with salt and pepper. The host of children from both the huts were licking their lips in expectation of their share. There is an unwritten law forbidding adults, at least those who have children, and above all the sorcerers, to eat snake meat. But the children were not affected by this taboo, nor had I any intention of missing this delicacy. I ladled out a plate of snake soup with a few pieces of the whitish meat, and distributed the remainder among the youngsters. Curiously I tasted the brew. I must say it was a long time since I had eaten anything so tasty. Rattlesnake meat could bear comparison with the choicest fish, and any gourmet would have ladled out this soup with delight. The only unpleasant thing was the rough, scaly skin. The Indians had not first skinned the snake, but had simply cut it up and thrown it into the pot, skin, scales, and all.